now.
Okay, thank you. So I was going to talk a little bit today about some research that I've been doing at the university, some of which we published just last year. I was a real architect before I became an academic in architecture, and my research is really considered architecture in its widest sense. So the kind of things that I'll be talking about today are not always obvious as matters that would be of concern to architecture and to architecture research. But there were things that I followed my own natural curiosity, I think, as a journey as an architect. And which one of these buttons moves the slide on? Sorry, guys, hold on 1 second. I'm not sure. Okay, yeah. So in 2003, the day that Johnny Cash actually died, I moved over to East Belfast, and for quite a while I was driving up and down the Newtonards Road on my way into practice in town, and quite often I get stuck in traffic around this junction near D Street, and this wall and walls like it along the Newtonards Road always caught my attention. And you'd be sitting there in traffic kind of staring at it, and I was thinking back to news reports during the Troubles, and I saw these walls and the way they blocked off the ends of streets, and I just assumed that this had something to do with conflict, and that those walls had been put there in response to conflict to stop people moving around and so forth. And it was a theme that kind of stayed in my head. And in my last 3 years of practice between 2007 and 2010, I was getting in and out to Ulster one day a week tutoring in third year. And as you do when you go into the university, you begin to get sort of sucked into the energy and the ideas that are being thrown around. And when a full-time post then came up in 2010, I took the opportunity to take the move. And I thought about maybe establishing a research program that would begin to kind of dig into some of these ideas that I had. And it's true to say that there's always been lots and lots of suspicion and conjecture about what happened with Belfast and its redevelopment during the Troubles. This was published back in 1982, the kind of caricature of the securocrats deciding, what was going to happen with the city. Before they then brought the architects and the planners in to talk about it. But the whole point, I suppose, of the academic research was to try and move beyond the suspicion and the conjecture and the rumor and actually find out, did something happen? Were the security forces involved with the, with the changes that took place in the city during the Troubles, and what was the nature of that involvement, and so on, to try and be able to talk about it maybe in a bit more of a kind of rigorous fashion. So I went digging and investigating as you do, and through a very painstaking process, I came across a lot of files like this. A lot of work that was produced in various housing departments during the Troubles, and they all bore these kinds of secret or confidential stamps. Like, thanks to Tony Blair and the Freedom of Information Act, a lot of this stuff survived, but none of it was originally ever meant to see the light of day. A lot of it was still very, very hard to find. This stuff doesn't sit in neat boxes. You have to go digging for it and put the story together. But I did uncover a lot of archives about that time that hadn't really been found before or spoken about. And what was really interesting about them was that because they were confidential or often secret conversations, they were remarkably explicit and talked in great candid detail about Belfast and about its housing and about its communities and about various concerns that the authorities had at that time. very rich sectarian language that to this day you would never find in any public-facing document, but we have in these private documents a very kind of candid description of what the thinking was at that time. And for me, as an architect, I was very drawn to the fact that there was so much discussion about the everyday houses and streets of the city. And these are some photographs that I usually show from the Belfast Telegraph's Troubles Archive, and they're a really useful reminder and often a really good indicator to people from other places about just how urbanized conflict was in Belfast. You know, the security forces, or sorry, the army, previously the British Army would have been in the former colonies, and here they were now in a very urban setting, and there was the need to begin to understand the streets and how they were being used as part of, I guess, military thinking at the time. And it was a war that was very much, or a conflict that was very much playing out on everybody's doorstep. You know, the ordinary streets were places that were of value to both paramilitary organizations and security forces. So what I discovered really was that whilst there were these, you know, flashpoint incidents and major kind of fronts in the conflict and issues, housing was kind of sitting there in the background as something that was very, very important to all people involved in the conflict at that time. And two things I think I discovered were really happening, and a lot of this will be history that is known to a lot of people on the call at the moment. Housing was in crisis during the 1970s in Belfast in two ways. Historically, in Belfast, there has been intercommunal conflict during times of heightened political tension. It's something that goes way back to the late 1800s, whenever the city was almost entirely Protestant, and Catholic migrants started moving into the city, chasing work in the shipyards and so on. And of course, that is, you know, that reoccurred through history, through the Home Rule crisis and various Home Rule crises, the Civil War, and so on. But there's a pattern where housing has been central to that conflict, where this is the city, you know, as it was really up until the 1970s, the dense gridiron of Victorian houses. And if you lived in a mixed area during one of those periods of heightened tensions, you were quite often forced out of your house. And quite often someone forced out of their house would then go to an area where they would be in the majority. So we had throughout the decades between the turn of the century and the beginning of the Troubles, this gradual process where the city was becoming consolidated into, increasingly consolidated into Catholic and Protestant areas. And then, of course, with the outbreak of the Troubles, that was massively exacerbated. I think there was something like 15,000 people in Greater Belfast alone were displaced. So from a housing point of view, what was emerging in the documents was a dilemma where if you were, I mean, it's impossible to talk about this without using the terms Catholic and Protestant. And I'm just reflecting the things that were stated in the files. So if you were a housing officer at that time, trying to manage with this, it was very complicated because of the nature of how housing policy had been developed in Northern Ireland. If you were a Protestant family displaced from Belfast, you tended to have more choice in where you could go. And there was evidence of tremendous move to places like Antrim and Glengormley and Carrickfergus. If you were a Catholic family, you didn't really have as much of an option, and people tended to retreat to what were historically the Catholic enclaves in the city. West Belfast is well known, Short Strand is another. So this created, by 1976, a very curious problem for the DOE and the NIO, who were overseeing government, where you had, in one case, say a vastly depopulated Protestant part of the city, where you could have acres of actually empty houses, right beside a very overcrowded Catholic enclave where you could have 4 or 5 families living in one house. But you couldn't use the empty houses to address the deficit because those areas were still in what was regarded as Protestant territory. And that was never stated, obviously, in any public document, but that was the discussion that was going on at the time in the archives that I discovered. And that obviously created huge tensions. So that was the major dilemma, was how do you deal with a housing crisis where you actually have both a deficit of housing and an increasing waiting list for housing. So in North Belfast alone, the waiting list for new houses was something like 7,000 or 8,000, whilst the surplus housing there that couldn't be occupied due to these territorial affiliations was over 10,000. And in tandem with that, you then had the actual condition of the housing itself. So this is where we're looking at a grid that had been in existence since the late 19th century. It was extremely dilapidated and regarded to be possibly the worst housing in Western Europe. A lot of it didn't even have functioning plumbing and indoor toilets and so forth. So you had this dilemma then in 1976 where these two processes really came to head. And so the story that I was able to really construct was of these two processes coming together. So on the one hand, you had announced, I think in late 1976 or early 1977, a sweeping program of inner city redevelopment for Belfast, very much in line with what had happened in Liverpool and what was ongoing in Glasgow at the time. A very public process, one that was not without, obviously, issue, but it was familiar and accepted kind of policy orthodoxy at the time. This is what we do. We go in and we redevelop the inner city. But in the background, the government also established a confidential security committee. And that committee didn't have architects or planners on it. It had the Assistant Chief Constable, Brigadier of the Army, and a couple of top civil servants. Their role was really to look at those plans and think about how they could be twisted and tweaked and revised in ways which might then benefit security strategy and deal with some of these tensions that were emerging on the ground. Now, that committee was responsible for putting in place Belfast's first permanent peace walls, many of which are well known to all of us and are now tourist attractions, very successful tourist attractions. But they also put in place what I was much more interested in were what we've called a series of hidden barriers. And this is where, in stark contrast to the big peace walls that we can see, where the committee used the everyday architecture of the city, the kind of commonplace stuff of urban redevelopment, to very much act in the same way as peace walls, and to begin to carve up the city and isolate it and create the very kind of fractured and disconnected inner city Belfast that we know today. So through an extensive program of archival research and interviews, and focus groups and workshops on the ground, we kind of stitched together what we thought were really 3 categories of these barriers that have emerged in our research. And that'll kind of give a very quick overview. The first were the most blatant. These are what we called inter-community hidden barriers. And this was where the committee almost sat down with a big red tip felt pen and decided to draw rings around areas that they wanted to isolate and areas that they wanted to divide. And then at the second level, there are those intra-community barriers within communities And that was almost like a second stage. Once you have an area isolated with permanent physical barriers around it, you then go into it and begin to break it up and fragment it. And then the third category that we discovered through our research are what we've called invisible boundaries. And these are almost like the after effects of the first two types of barriers. And I can show you a few quick examples of each of them, which will maybe help illustrate what I'm talking about. So this, my kind of opinion that these three processes working together, the public redevelopment program and the private confidential security committee behind the scenes tweaking it, have very much given us this fractured city today, where unlike the urban grid or the urban Victorian grid, where you could effectively travel from one part of the city to the other uninterrupted, where all the streets, even though they were territorialized, all the borders between areas were effectively open. We now have a rigidly defined material environment where there are permanent physical boundaries between many areas, as we know. The best way of it is usually just to kind of talk about this, is to show examples. And this is the Short Strand part of Belfast in the 1970s. It might be familiar to some people on the call. And again, you see that very dense open Victorian grid. Short Strand was a particular headache for the committee because you have the green and orange. The green areas were recognised very much as being overcrowded Catholic streets. The orange zone were streets that were becoming kind of depopulated as Protestants were kind of moving out of the city. We had this weird zone in the middle around Templemore Avenue, where there was a little bit of mixing between the two, and it was acted something of a buffer between the two areas. And the DOE had what I thought was an extremely enlightened approach at this time, where they saw that as the potential place to address some of the housing issues that Short Strand faced. There wasn't enough housing. There wasn't enough space to rehouse the amount of people that were in Short Strand as it was through redevelopment, never mind cope with the increased demand and all the people that were, additionally squatting or sort of taking up residency in houses. So they put forward a proposal that this mixed housing area where houses were empty because it was depopulating, that perhaps that could be given over to Short Strand. And then also they bought the old carpet factory that I've identified on the map, the old Spence Bryson carpet factory, and thought, again, here we have a brownfield site that can be put to good use, and that will help to ease some of the problems. But the committee were able to, through their position, completely shut this down, and they saw actually the position of the carpet factory as being this kind of fundamental piece. And it's wonderful to go through the archives and find these little doodles and sketches. So rather than give the carpet factory over to new housing to address the problem in Short Strand, they wanted to do something else with it. There was a worry that you couldn't have Catholic houses beside the Orange Hall, that you couldn't have them beside an Orange Parade route at the bottom of the Albert Bridge Road. So the decision was to chop the site up into three. The hatched zone would be an area that would go to Short Strand, but then, and again, this is the power of the committee, they come up with other uses to put the rest of the site fallow, because there was no demand on the Protestant side for new housing, so there was no justification to put housing back there. So it was decided, yeah, okay, why don't we throw an NIHE maintenance depot there? Then on the other side, let's just put some commercial stuff. So that will form a barrier between the two. that's the map sort of superimposed into the wider diagram, and the red are highlighting the different things that were other reasons given by the committee why Short Strand couldn't expand into that area. The presence of the Protestant primary school was one, and the parade route, the Newton Ards Road. So we had a situation there where potentially there could have been a different path, ended up being one of the hardest interfaces in the city. And when I take people out on the tour of these different barriers, this very innocuous looking collection of buildings at the bottom of the Albert Bridge Road is actually put in place with the same divisive intent as those blatant peace walls. And Bryson Street, we're looking head on into Bryson Street into what was the Spence Bryson carpet factory that should have been the housing for Short Strand, but it is today closed off with that wall. So that example kind of gives you an idea of the power that this committee had, where the everyday stuff of the city was their modeling clay to really go around and decide what goes where, with nary a planner in the room or architect to advise on the long-term consequences of that. Let's skim over a couple of other examples. At Old Park, Lower Old Park, Ardoyne and Cliftonville, around the same time, similar issues. Lots of people pouring into Cliftonville and Ardoyne who had been displaced from areas like Rathcoole or Craiga. And again, lots of people leaving Lower Old Park. I mean, this was a part of the city that was tremendously impacted by killing. It was called, it was the murder triangle it was recognised as, because of the extraordinary number of deaths that occurred. And there was a huge move of Protestant residents out of Lower Old Park. So this was one of the most stark examples where this whole zone was almost derelict, and you had good sound houses, as they were referred to, but had been bricked up and boarded up to protect them. And then on the two yellow zones in Cliftonville and Ardoyne, you had houses that were overcrowded, and again, the conditions of 4 or 5 families living in a house, and residents clamoring for more housing and wondering why they can't move into these empty houses. But there was a fear in the committee that if that happened, that there would be, well, 2 things would happen. You would have this huge, what they called a huge Catholic ghetto that would be problematic. And then also that would eventually wipe out what remained of Lower Old Park. So the decision was taken then to actually knock all of those good houses down and rezone it for industrial use. And today that's where Hillview Industrial Estate sits. You can just about see the houses of Ardoyne, some new housing in Ardoyne on the left there, and on the right hand side, the ridges of some of the housing in Lower Old Park. By being able to co-opt other government departments to use the area for industrial use is a really, really effective way of putting in a barrier that permanently protected Lower Old Park, which has continued, over the decades to lose population. So we know there's the Manor Street Peace Wall there on the right-hand side that closes off Cliftonville at that end, and then Hillview connects it to form this continuous barrier between the 2 areas. So no matter what the population demand is for in Cliftonville or Ardoyne, it cannot grow beyond that line. And even though there is this, you can even see it on the map, the surplus of land that sits in Lower Old Park, that zone is fundamentally protected from any further territorial encroachment. And we all know from the whole Girdwood issue of just about how contentious housing is in that area. Sometimes it was a bit more blunt. This was early Twinbrook in the late 1970s, and there was worry that squatting that was happening in Twinbrook would spill across this shared area that existed between Twinbrook and Arima. They shared the Summerhill Road between them, the football pitches. Whenever tensions were high in Belfast, fights used to break out in this zone. So what do you do about that? Well, the link road connecting Polglass had to go somewhere. So the committee made sure that it went through that zone between Twinbrook and Arima to completely disconnect the two and to permanently eliminate the chance of any conflict between the two. It's like I always say to people when I show that slide, you can take a piece wall down. You can't undo. Well, I guess you could undo a 4-lane dual carriageway, the banks, the screening, the trees, but it's an incredibly divisive barrier. And like all of them, because it's so kind of nondescript and it uses the everyday architecture of that redevelopment process that we're all familiar with, the inner ring roads and the housing, that it sits there in the environment, normalized within the city. And two estates which actually did enjoy good community relations. Twinbrook for a long time was a model mixed religion state. We're completely separated and now only connected by a completely horrendous pedestrian link that you take your life in your hands actually crossing between the two across that 60-mile-an-hour carriageway. And then the final kind of example of those big barriers, I appreciate time's moving on, was at Ligonier in the north of the city. That yellow line shows what was identified in 1976 as being the last greenfield site available in Belfast to build housing for displaced Catholics. So that was the line in a confidential report. But it was problematic because it sat beside an area, the Squires Hill area, and Squires Hill was referred to as a middle class, majority Protestant owner-occupied estate. And the Security Committee was very concerned about the idea of putting what they called council houses beside a settled estate like this. And they had a number of reasons. So that's the layout of the proposed housing. In the first instance, they said there's a problem building Catholic housing right beside the Protestant primary school, and the kids playing in those pitches would be intimidated by the presence of that housing. And then the second reason was that if you build that housing next to Squires Hill, people will likely squat in the housing before it's handed over. They will likely be hardline Republican sympathizers. They will then begin a process of intimidating people out of Squires Hill. Then you'll have a process where Squires Hill becomes Republican, and you'll have a huge Republican zone across the Crumlin Road from the Silverstream area, which was then regarded as being a really hardline loyalist estate. This is a series of conjectures built upon each other to justify why they didn't want any housing built there. But a curious thing happened, because I think the planners were under such pressure at this time that they had approved the scheme and the committee didn't get to it in time, and word leaked to the press. So this was going to happen. So they had to retreat and think, well, what can we do? This is going to be approved. What can we do to begin to address some of our concerns? So the Minister for Housing at the time slipped these planning conditions into the approval. And as we all know, planning conditions are usually fairly innocuous. But these are quite strange. So the first was about putting a particularly heavy planting, 12 meters between the two developments. The second condition was really to do with making sure that none of the houses were occupied or squatted in. So that was really a temporary thing to do with its construction. The third is a curious one. They didn't want any housing executive houses facing the private development. And the fourth, that there would be no access, whatever, vehicular or pedestrian, between the two developments. So today, that it's a photograph we actually took from a cherry picker, is that vegetation barrier. You can just about see in the background the houses, what were housing executive houses, and to the lower foreground, the houses of Squires Hill. To this day, no government department has taken ownership of that, and it sits there. Some of the trees are dying. Some of the residents will prune the trees that are on their property, but it sits as a barrier between the two estates. And then the idea about the houses not facing one another, as we all know, you can't take an approved housing layout and all of a sudden start turning houses around. But what you can do is you can rub out where it says living room, and you can write kitchen, and you can rub out front garden and write backyard. So they flipped the program of the houses that had any kind of aspect over the private housing. I took this photograph a number of years ago, and people have almost tried to engineer it back, and you can see, the slight bay window, an attempt to create a terrace, but they're all kind of compromised by the kitchen window height. The school, which is kind of an unfortunate thing, the school went ahead and actually abandoned their football pitches to create the barrier that the security forces had wanted. That still exists today. And then in more recent times, when Squires Hill was extended during the property boom, the residents of Ligoneel and the residents of Squires Hill got together and tried to organise the building of a peace wall between them. So it was no longer a committee this time, but the residents themselves. And the government had to come down and talk them into building this instead. So they call this an environmental corridor. That way it doesn't appear in any list of peace walls or interfaces. But the sad thing is that today, some 40 years later, after conflict, almost 4 decades later, you have this conclusive barrier between those two developments. Houses that are a few meters away, back to back, are 45 to an hour a minute walk between the two. And like all of those kind of hidden barriers I've talked about, they are so embedded into the everyday environment of the city that they almost hide in plain sight. So that's a kind of sour note, I suppose, to kind of end things on. On a slightly more positive note, we did a lot of work on this and been engaging with the government, and I'm happy to report that we're beginning to work with the Department of Justice, and we're going to be going out to these various communities and others that were affected by these barriers, and begin to talk to them about the history and the reasons that they're there. Whether they make it onto a list of barriers to be removed or transformed is yet unknown, but I think it's really good and positive that they're beginning to tackle those issues. But again, as we all know, there's enough contention around the peace walls. These are all hugely problematic parts of the city where issues of housing are central to who gets returned in various elections. There's a lot of politics in the background. So we're not really sure what's going to happen with it, but I think we're delighted that somebody is willing to listen, and kind of looking forward to going out on the ground and actually talking to people about what the impact of these are, and get their opinions and thoughts on what should happen next. So I think I'll just leave it there. To go through the other types would probably end up, we'd run way over time, and I appreciate that we've hit 2 o'clock already. So let me just leave it there if that's okay.
Thanks, David. That was very illuminating what happened in that's all in the 1970s, presumably, all of that.
Yeah, late 70s, early 80s, it all played out. Yeah.
Well, I noticed when we were in doing the President Medal with the students, there was quite a few of the schemes